Welcome to CIS 118 Web Development and Design Foundations. Today I'd like to cover Chapter 9 of our textbook, Forms and Form Controls, and a little bit about server-side processing or server-side scripting. Before I do, a couple of comments about what we did last week. So last week we were introduced to Chapter 8, how to set up tabular information in our web page. And of course, tables have a storied history in HTML because before CSS was used to style the page, information was typically structured using a table and content was placed in those table cells. That's no longer the case. So Chapter 8 covered how to structure tables using CSS, and we did some homework exercises in class, which were recorded. And then we also made the modifications to our Pacific Trails running case, whereby we added a table to the yurts page, and we had to put some additional CSS in our Pacific.css style sheet. Both of those files are the only two that needed to be submitted for the running case homework for Chapter 8. And then, of course, before I get started in Chapter 9 here, a nod to the midterm exam. So that should have been done Sunday night, and if it's still not completed, you'll have to give me some type of reason why it wasn't completed, because it's been open for a week. I want you all to be successful, and I'm just perplexed that in spite of the fact that I do almost all of the homework in class, and I literally do all of the running case in class, I've got people that are just not turning that in. So I understand you might not want to suffer through the lecture or listen to me. I know that it's painful when I go back and look and see myself talking, but you know, short of showing up in class, that's the only thing that you've got at your disposal. So if there is something going on, I've said this before, you're going to have to reach out to let me know what it is, because I can't help you if I don't know. Okay. So again, Chapter 8, tables, and then how to style tables with CSS. Today we're going to cover forms and form controls. So after we cover the content in this chapter, you should understand what the common uses of forms are on a web page. And of course, forms are used all over the place by web developers to collect information from web page visitors. And how are we going to create web pages using form, input, text area, and select elements? I'm going to talk about that in a second, but form is just the new element. That means it's an open and closing container tag in HTML that allows you to define the body of your form. And we have several different form controls available to us that allow us to basically grab information from the user and then validate that information without having to write our own scripts or our own code and embed that as JavaScript on our users page, or the website that we're visiting as a client. And we can also create our forms to provide additional accessibility features for folks who rely upon assistive technologies. And we can use something called an access key attribute to define a hotkey on a web page. We can set up a tab index if people are using the keyboard rather than a mouse, because they've got a situation where a mouse is not the most comfortable way to interact with your web page. We can also set up our own custom buttons. We can use graphics to define image buttons. And we can also use a button element and define any piece of our web page to act as a button on a form. Of course, we're going to use CSS to style that form. And then I'm going to show you how to use some of the new GWiz HTML5 form controls that will validate the user's input, specifically to make sure it matches the form of an email, a URL. Show you how to use a drop-down, which is also called a data list, how to use a slider, which will define a range of values. Instead of people typing it in, they can just slide left and right and get a number. Spinner accomplishes the same type of thing, except it doesn't use a slider. And then a couple of interesting ways to get dates from your user. You can use the calendar feature. You can even ask them about color controls if you want to dynamically change the user's experience. So we'll cover all of those enhanced features in HTML5. And then once all that data is collected on the form, of course, it has to get packaged up and sent off to a server for processing. So we're going to talk a little bit about how the client communicates to the server and what it sends to the server and how it sends it to that server in terms of how we're going to invoke server-side processing. And for the exercises in the chapter and for our running case, we're going to use the website that has been provided by the publisher, but there are a lot of free sites out there that will also let you use the server to test your page. Okay, so the basics of a form. Forms are all, at their most generic level, designed to accept information and provide an interactive way to do that. You have all used forms before in terms of Google searches or Amazon orders or newsletter sign-ups, surveys, registering here at Lake Michigan College. So forms are a ubiquitous feature of modern websites. So there is actually a form tag. It's an HTML element. It's a container. So that means it's got an open and closing tag. And within it, we can put in text boxes, which would require a text entry of some sort. We can use checkboxes. We can use buttons to submit or reset that information. And there's several other controls that we're going to be able to put inside the container. But the form is the web user's interface. And then once that information is collected, it is packaged up and then sent off to the server. And the server may take it and send an email, or it might write some type of cookie to the file, or might query and update a database, or some other type of processing that you've defined when you created the form and when you have knowledge of what the server is going to do with that information. So some basic tags that you have to understand. So the form is the container that brackets the body of your form on your web page. The input tag is a standalone tag. It's not a container tag that identifies which type of input or form elements to use in the form. A text area is used to set up a scrolling text box where if you've got more than one line of text, and that is a container tag, so it has a open and closing tag. The select box will give you a drop-down list, so that's a container tag, and then the options configure the particular choices that you have available to you in the select box. So these are some of the basic HTML elements that we use to set up our form, and I'm going to demo these here in a moment. But the simplest HTML form, open and closing tag form, this is the information that's displayed on the screen. And then I have specified an input field, and I have defined it as a text box. So that will produce a text box to the right of the email label. And then these two fields, name and ID, are internal. They're not used, they're not displayed rather to the user. And the ID defines that particular form on the web page. So the ID, like other IDs we've used in our CSS, are used internally within that web page. And it could be your HTML, CSS refers to that, or it could be you've got your own script running there, JavaScript that's dynamically changing the site. But the name field is what's ascribed to that control, so the server can identify the value of information or the type of information that came back from the user. So these are typically the same. There are a couple instances here where they're not, when you're selecting from one of a group of values. But the name is going to be the handle essentially that the server uses to refer to that information. So in terms of the form elements attributes, you also have to specify what action needs to be taken. You could, if you just wanted to go into test mode, you could define it as a mail to and send an email to yourself to make sure that that form data is being used properly, but you would never do that in a production environment because it's not secure. And more than that, if you set it up that way and a client or a user saw it, it would say that it's a security violation. You'd never see them again. But you have to have an action that's going to be taken when you hit submit on that form. And it's going to go off and send it to the server where it's processed. And then you have to define the method that's going to be used to send that information off to the server. The get method, which is not secure, but that's the default value, where it just gets appended to the URL that you are going to send it to, but it's naked and exposed. Or you can use the post method, where that content of the form is passed inside the HTTP entity. So it will be, if you use HTTPS, for instance, as your transfer protocol, it would be secure. So again, the name identifies the form, the ID identifies the form, but the ID identifies the form to your web page, and name identifies the form to the server. So that's the distinction, and it'll be clear when we use it here in a couple of examples. So what if I want to use a text box? Inside my form, I define as my input the attribute type equal text, and that gives me my text box. And then the other attributes that I would specify would be the name and ID, and I can specify the size, and I can specify the maximum length, and I can even specify a default value. But the three that you absolutely have to provide here are the type of input control you're going to use, and then you have to assign it a name and an ID, and they have to be unique on the form. I can also set up a scrolling text box. I use that with text area, and then I can define, again, it's got to have a name and an ID, and I can define the number of rows and the number of columns. So that would set the size of the scrolling text box, for instance, if people want to submit a comment. I can also of course, include a submit button on the page. So when you use that type equal submit as one of your input controls, your form controls, it's going to trigger whatever action you've got specified up in the form tag. In other words, it will package up that information and send it off to the server, and whatever values have been collected from the user will be associated with that name field that you provided in the form. So like I said earlier, the name field is the one that is used to identify the values of the information that got sent off from the user to the server. And then of course I can also embed a reset button. So if I, again, put my, this is a self-contained tag. If I specify my input field and then type equal reset, it'll put a reset button on my page. And you should be able to pretty easily create a form that looks like this. You're just going to have your open and closing form tags, and you could put a header in there, and you're going to have 3 text box, and then you're going to have 1 text area. And then you'll also include a submit button, but you'll call it contact rather than submit. And then you will include a reset button. We'll do some more of this when we actually get into the homework and do the running case modifications. But it doesn't take much in the way of HTML to create a form that looks pretty user-friendly. I can also, instead of providing a text box, or just type equal text, I can use the attribute type equal password, and that will suppress the typing as the user uses that field in my form. I can also use checkboxes, and I just specify in the attribute field type equal checkbox. And again, for all of these controls, I have to have a name and an ID. But if it's this type of data, I have to flag if it's checked or not, and then what the value is associated with it if it's checked. So these are not mutually exclusive. I could include none to all of these checkboxes. If I want to have a mutually exclusive list of data, in other words, I want to force people to pick one of several different options, then I have to use what's called a radio button. You guys have done this before. They're called radio buttons because you can't listen to 2 stations at the same time. So this would be a way to present predetermined items to a user. So these features would all have a type equal radio, and then you still have to have a name and an ID field, but based upon which one of those radio buttons they picked, the value that you associate with that name would be different. In other words, hey, you send the server whatever value they picked out of the mutually exclusive radio buttons. You can also, for internal processing purposes, put a control that's not displayed on the web page. It's called a hidden form field. And you put that in there so the scripts that are running on both your web page and the server can get that information. And they're used kind of as a landing pad that contains information that people need as they move through your website from page to page. It's kind of like an internal storage as people are providing information and you're processing their request. Okay, so other features that I can use on my web page. So I can configure what's called a select list. I call it a drop-down list or a drop-down box, and you can put in the values that are associated with this particular list, and then the user, depending upon how many you decide to display, the user will pick one of the items in the drop-down. So this is, again, a select list, and the option tags here define what's going to be displayed in the select list. And again, you can configure it so they must click the drop down and pick one out of a number of products or a number of choices, which is what I typically do if there's going to be a whole bunch. But if there's only going to be a couple, you can just show the whole list of options right out of the gate. Okay, so what if you want to associate your own graphic as a button for the submit form? You don't want to use the one that's generated by the browser. Again, if you include the submit button, which every form should have some form of submit button, that's going to trigger the action that you've defined in the form tag and basically send it off to the server using a certain type of protocol. But let's say you don't like that button. Okay, so you can say, you can include the attribute type equal image, and then you have to specify the source file for the image. So instead of just submit, we've got to get this little graphic, this GWiz 3D graphic that says log in. I can also define anything as a button. It's a container tag. That means it's got an open and closing tag. And that way I can associate both text and the graphic as my button. So down here, I've got both the graphic and the text that is defined in my button container. So this whole block, both the graphic and the text, becomes my submit button. And I can specify that as the possible attributes as submit, reset, and then the type is button. So by default, if you just use the submit, you will get that plain Jane submit button as defined by the browser. Okay, what about making your form accessible to people who don't see so well or they don't have real fine motor skills to use a mouse on your website? Well, there are things you can do. You can define labels that are used on that form and then would be accessed by speech readers. I can collectively group those features together in some type of logical collection. That's called a field set. I can even put a legend around that grouping of form controls. And then I can define hotkeys with my access key attribute, and I can define the order in which my form fields are visited every time the user presses the tab key on the keyboard rather than hovering around and mousing around. So if I want to use the label element, again, it's a container. This is going to associate a text label with a particular form control. There are two ways that you can go. You can just enclose the input. You can enclose the input control in the label, or you can break it out and associate the label through the use of the ID on the web page. So this is the better way to go. It gives you the greatest flexibility. So this is another example where the ID that I've picked on my web page can be used by other controls in my HTML file. So what does Fieldset do for you? Again, it's a container tag. That means it's got an open and closing tag, and it basically provides like a box, a border, a visual grouping around a whole bunch of form elements that are logically related. And then the legend element is also a container tag, and it's going to give you the text field that you define within the field set. So if you do want a legend associated with this grouping, then you have to put the down here inside the field set, you have to put the legend tags, and that will allow me to get this textual information on top of this boxed in group of controls. And what do I have in here? I've got I've got 3 different text boxes, right? Name, email address, it'd be first name, last name, and email address. Okay, so if I want to change the way that a user gets to fields on my form by pressing the tab key, by default it's just top down. Whatever you've got in your source file, the order in which they are encountered top down is the order in which they will tab through. But if you don't want that, you can redefine the tab order, and you use the tab index with a numerical value, and that's the order in which they traverse. If you've got 2, if you screw up and you've got 2 in there that have the same type, it'll do the one that's first encountered in the file before it does the second one in the file with the same duplicate index. Or you can define a hotkey. So on Windows, you can get to that by using Control plus whatever the key is. So if I wanted a hotkey to get to the email field on my form, I would use the access key attribute, and then I'd use an uppercase E, and then I'd have to let them know that they'd have to press Control E or somehow indicate that that was the hotkey for them to get to that particular field. So this is, again, an approach that is consistent with assistive technologies, in that a lot of people don't have fine motor control to use the mouse, and they can just use the tab indexes and the access keys that you define and get to every field on your form without having to use the mouse. So when we're styling our form, when we're defining our form, you want to use some type of wireframe model, the box model here, and collectively associate all these different fields, and then work from your wireframe or your box model, and then use CSS to set up the stylistic attributes of those fields. I can set background colors, padding, font types, if I want the particular labels to float, if I want them to be a particular size, if I want to define the text area of a scrolling text box to be of a certain pixel size, if I want it to be displayed in a block format, I can define tags that I would then use later on in my form. So everything that we've done so far in the course, we can style those elements with CSS, and a form's no exception. Okay, so what eventually happens when you collect information from the form is you press the submit button, or the user presses the submit button, and then it packages up that information and sends it off to the server. So with that information, the web server might locate files that you've requested and send them down to your browser. It might update a database. It might process a form. Whatever it is your information is used for at the server end, then that server passes back down to the browser, and the browser then takes those return files and then displays them on the user's interface. So there's always a connection between the client and the server in terms of information being passed back and forth, and you can have those pages on the client be dynamic by writing your own JavaScript, and then you have the information on the server dynamically built, and that's using several different languages or technologies are out there, but PHP is a pretty common one. So in the old days, at least before CSS, there was this common gateway interface, and that was the protocol for a web server to pass a web page, uses requests through an application program, and then send that information back down to the user. But now we've got server-side scripting that runs off there on the server, And PHP is the most generic flavor of that language, and we cover that in CIS 221 here. It's a capstone course in the web development certificate series here at the college. And then there are also active server pages. Adobe's got a product that provides server-side scripting, Microsoft.net, ASP.net. So these are all directly executed. The script is run either by the web server itself or as an extension module to the web server. So you've got great efficiency. So how does that actually work then? How do you talk to the server? So that your client's web page is going to get information collected on a form, and the user's going to press the submit button, and then that's going to invoke whatever processing type that you defined in your form. And then it's going to go off to the web server, and the web server is going to execute some server-side script to deal with that information. It's going to look at the information based on the name fields that you associated with all of your input elements, and it will either process against a database, or it's going to generate some type of file or do some transaction, and then it'll send back down to the client the HTML necessary to redisplay that information now that it's been modified. So what do you typically use that processing for? Searching a database, placing an order at Amazon, sending a web page over to a friend, subscribing to a newsletter, sending an email. So server-side scripting is an integral part of our access to the web. We just take that for granted as clients. So in the context of our course, how are we going to send the information we collect out of our form off to a server and have it be processed in some way that will at least acknowledge that our form is working properly? Because you can't do that. And well, I guess I could show you how to turn your own laptops into a server, and you could talk to yourself in a way. But the easiest way to deal with that in the context of this course is you're going to, in your form control, specify a method of post. So that's going to encapsulate that information. And then you're going to send it off to this PHP script that's sitting at Pearson's website. And what it'll do is it'll acknowledge that your form's working, and it'll just spit out all the information that you had tied to the name fields inside of your HTML. If you want to use some third-party sites that allow you to take advantage of scripts for free, of course, you generally have to deal with ads, so you get what you pay for, right? But FormBuddy is the one that I've used. Form Assembly, I've heard some feedback about that one being pretty good. So if you just want to test your scripts, that's the way to go. What about different scripting technologies? PHP, Ruby on Rails, Microsoft.net, Java server pages for the Oracle database, Adobe's Cold Fusion. Those are all mainstream scripting technologies. So if you are looking to get a job as a web developer, you will have to learn those technologies, even if you are not actually working within that medium. You have to know how to communicate with those servers. But again, in 221, we cover PHP, and we also have that coursework aligned with a third-party certification. Okay, so what about some of the new features that are in HTML5? And again, these features, if a client doesn't have a browser that supports them, they're backward compatible. So you don't have to worry about it not working at all or not showing up. So these are all enhancements. So you have an input tag, and then here the type would be email. Sorry, I have a typo here. It should be E-M-A-I-L. And if you put type equal email, it has to be of the form something at something dot whatever. So you can't just type text. And notice it'll validate the data for free, right? You get that for free. It's built into the HTML. Before that, you would have to have written a script to validate it. Here's another one. Input type of URL. It will expect you to type in a legitimate URL. And again, all of these have a name and ID that you must provide. The rest of these are optional. You can use type equal telephone. It'll force it to enter telephone numbers in numeric format, and it'll have to type them in as 7 or 10 digits. I think you can adjust in fact, I know you can adjust the values. And then a lot of these have the required attribute as well. So if you click on the required attribute, they won't be able to submit the form unless that information is provided. Now, a lot of these new HTML5 features, particularly the required attribute, are not supported in old browsers. It'll just ignore it, like everything else in the browser that it doesn't understand. It just ignores it. You can also provide what's called a search text box, and that will allow you to structure wildcards in the search. I can use what's called a data list control. So this is kind of like a drop down with a text box, in that I will give them an array of choices in the drop down like I would a select or a drop down list, select list or drop down list, but I also get the added ability of them typing in whatever the heck they want. So they can use one of the options that I've provided, like in this instance, it's type in whatever your favorite color is. Well, what if I want to type in, I don't know, chartreuse? Okay, well, I would still accept that. Now notice here in the form, so my data list has an ID of colors, and my name has an ID color. My ID for the form control is color, but my list is associated with the list of IDs. So all these individual values, red, green, blue, and so on, or if they were to provide this in a text, in the text box portion, these would be the values that get passed over to the server as the name. Okay. I can also use a slider. So if I don't want people to type in a number, I can just use this slider tool. And again, it's type input, where did it go? Type equal range. And then you have to specify a minimum and max. And then that way they can just slide to whatever numeric value they want to use. Similar feature is a spinner. This time it's type equal number. And then they'll have these little up and down arrows that they can cycle through up to the between the min and the max that you provide as the range for the control. I can also use type equal date, and then they'll be presented with a calendar to pick a particular date, and then you don't have to worry about them properly forming the date in your input field. So that's a nice feature that's built into the new HTML5. And then the color control. I have not used this at all on any of the web pages that I have developed, and this particular control is new to the 8th edition, by the way. So those of you still using the 7th edition of the text won't have this available to you. But again, the input type is color, and then they can pick predefined colors, and this is based on your browser, or they can go in and pick a particular color using CMYK values. So you should anticipate that your form will look differently depending upon the browser that you're trying to use with it. So whether you're using Internet Explorer, the browser used to download other browsers, or Chrome, or Firefox, or Safari, or Opera, depending upon which product you're using and which version you're using, your forms may look differently. So for instance, you know, the slider feature is enabled here in this browser, and if you are using an HTML5 feature that is not supported in your client's browser, it will simply convert them all to text boxes. So, you know, it's not like anything's going to, the wheels are going to come off the road or whatever. It's just that you won't be able to take advantage of that GWiz feature. Okay, so lots of cool techniques, lots of cool tools that we can use here in designing our forms. Every one of them has a container tag form, and then you have to define your input controls. You should have a reset and a submit on there, and then whatever other features, whatever type of input control you feel is appropriate. I strongly suggest that you use that legend ability and define those areas of logical groupings of your controls, and then understand that you also specify the action on your form tag. understand that that information gets sent off to the server, and if you use the one that's defined in the textbook, it's simply going to echo print the data that was collected by your form using the name fields that you provided in those elements. So make sure that when you set those fields up, that you are diligent about using the name and the ID field to identify those. Also, even though I said it was mostly for assistive technologies, you should probably use the label elements on your form, because that way people with assistive technologies will be able to work with your site. You don't ever want to turn away a customer. And then again, I mentioned this already, make sure you use the field set and the legend to logically group clusters of controls. Okay, so that's it for presentation on forms. Next time I see you, we'll go over the homework and then make the modification to our running case study and have it talk to the publisher's website just to echo print the data that's collected by our form. As always, any questions, please message me through Canvas. Otherwise, have a great day. See you next time.